constructivism as an approach to the treatment of autistic spectrum disorder and really other developmental disabilities as well. Now, as it turns out, I'm a constructivist, and the area of constructivism, which involves Piagetian approaches to assessment and intervention, have been really my focus of my career and my research. And strangely enough, of all the different approaches to intervention that I've been speaking about, it's constructivism that actually is giving me the most challenge to try to deliver information online. And that's because I have to talk primarily. That is, the only way I can convey information to you across the internet is by talking or by showing videotapes and stuff that you can observe others doing things. The problem is that as a constructivist, I don't think talking is the only way to teach. In fact, I'm not sure speech is the best way to deliver information. There is an alternative, and that is through action, through actually engaging in goal-directed behavior involving actual manipulation of objects and people. If you're a speech-language pathologist, when you're in clinic, you will actually get to manipulate not only objects, but people as you design intervention. And it's in the process of doing more concrete goal achievement and problem solving that a lot about language can be acquired. So online, I don't have a chance, I don't get the opportunity to play with you, essentially. Whereas person to person, it's typical for me to actually give students problem-solving tasks. In fact, you'll have an experience with me when we meet face-to-face where I'll let you have work on a bit of a problem involving something that you can actually manipulate to get a sense of what I'm talking about here. Because that's what kids do. They don't simply learn by having people talk at them. They don't spend their day listening to blah, 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 talk, speech. They sit on the floor or on their chair or wherever and play with toys or one another, often in a physical way. So that's where I'm headed. What I am going to do is present right now a videotape of a constructivist intervention that I have done, and you've seen some versions of it in prior video, I know, during prior lectures. For example, that tube hiding situation that I did, and I'm sure I showed you others. Here's another one involving a pulley and a child with autistic spectrum disorder who was between 6 and 7 at the time of the video. This was taken a while ago. Take a look, and then I'll come back to you.
Pull! Sit down. Pull! Sit. Pull! Good, good. Oops! Pull! Ronaldo got the Pepsi. Oh, look, that's the Pepsi. Good boy. Good boy. Ronaldo. That's a cup. That's a cup. You want the Pepsi? Yeah. Up, 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 up. Up, 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 up. Up, 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 up. Up, 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 up. Jenny, look. Look. Come down. Come down. Whoop. Ronaldo got the Pepsi. Good boy. Here we go. Let's get inside. Ronaldo, here. Pepsi.
Green slide.
God, I win! I win!
You win, you win.
Green slide.
How do you?
Uh-oh, here comes the pink slide.
The tubes, Hottie, match your dress. The red slide.
Red slide.
The assumptions of or premises of constructivism. Well, the Bloom intentionality position that we're taking in this course, and the Bloom and Leahy position on language as a structural involving relationships in the areas of content, form, and use, pretty much sum up constructivism. The primary function of language from a constructivist point of view is that the child concerns the child's having an internal drive to share intent, their own intent, their conscious awareness, their ideas, their thoughts and feelings about the world, and they want to share that with another. The desire is termed by Bloom, if you remember, intersubjectivity. And therefore, the primary function of language is to represent and express conscious awareness. All other functions of language, commanding, requesting, imitating, etc., follow the expression of conscious awareness. That is the reason for language. So, the development, constructivism focuses in on processes that contribute to the development of content of the assumptions of or premises of constructivism. Well, the Bloom intentionality position that we're taking in this course, and the Bloom and Leahy position on language as a structural involving relationships in the areas of content, form, and use, pretty much sum up constructivism. The primary function of language from a constructivist point of view is that the child concerns the child's having an internal drive to share intent, their own intent, their conscious awareness, their ideas, their thoughts and feelings about the world, and they want to share that with another. The desire is termed by Bloom, if you remember, intersubjectivity. And therefore, the primary function of language is to represent and express conscious awareness. All other functions of language, commanding, requesting, imitating, etc., follow the expression of conscious awareness. That is the reason for language. So, the development, constructivism focuses in on processes that contribute to the development of content of mind, awareness, and the representation of the world in your mind. So, what is the process about? It involves recognition of problems and active problem solving in the course of setting and achieving goals. From a constructivist point of view, all knowledge is organized around goal achievement. And knowledge comes from feedback from sensory motor action. Like I said at the very beginning, it does not come from speaking. It comes from physically moving. It comes from feedback, that is information that you get when you're trying to achieve an objective. Now, there are two kinds of feedback. There is interpersonal feedback, which refers to information received from other people, and there is sensory motor feedback. And sensory motor feedback concerns information received from the senses as you're manipulating objects and solving problems and working to achieve your objectives. As you apply what Piaget and structuralists refer to as schemes, these organized procedures that you apply to achieve things. Sensory motor feedback comes through the senses. And don't forget, the senses are not just vision, audition, olfactory sense, touch, one kind of touch, and what else do we refer to most commonly? At least those. But don't forget proprioception, which has to do with recognizing where your body is in space, because that's what's going on when you're manipulating. Your body is making relationships and is really following objects that you're manipulating. Kinesthetics, which is the act of moving, the proprioception through movement. The vestibular system, which helps to perhaps integrate the sensory information and certainly keep you upright as you engage with the world, and therefore stable. That's, in other words, feedback, both interpersonal, but most importantly, personal through one's own actions, underlies ultimately the development of mental representation and more complex forms of organization. Again, I remind you that we have two elements of language that we are always talking about, and that applies to all components of language, all components of content, all components of form, all components of use. Those two components are information taken in from the environment and from others, and organization, the kinds of relationships we make as we establish objectives, think about the world, try to achieve our goals, and try to resolve our problems. This relationship making is influenced most directly by this these constructivist processes. And one of the most important processes is the last one on this list, on this particular PowerPoint, and that is constructing knowledge involves reflection and organization. Reflection, that is thinking. It's not enough to do. Operant interventions focus on doing, the act of doing, and there's such a one of the big advertisements or slogans of operant intervention is error-free learning, the potential for error-free learning, meaning analyze tasks down to their smallest achievable components and allow kids to achieve success. They'll chain successes together to create more complex tasks. Well, doing something is not necessarily thinking about something. You can often do things without thinking about them. Think of a baby who assists mom in the drinking from a bottle. Think about you and me. When we drive a car or ride a bicycle, we're not thinking necessarily about every move we make. We just act. Acting is not enough for mental representation, which is what language is all about. We need to reflect, that is, move information from the doing level internally to the thinking level, so we have represented and we can reflect. So thinking and reflecting, now that could happen while we're working to achieve goals and solve problems. It could happen later, say when we dream about something or sit quietly and something pops into our heads, whatever. But there needs to also be reflection. And those are, there is the fundamental basis of processes that are the basis for constructivism. Let me just go back and say this business of error-free learning, save us from that, I would have to say. I certainly have never learned anything without making errors. I don't not make errors. And if I make an error, quote unquote, or my children come up with the wrong answer or run into trouble as they're trying to do something, I expect them to, and my own self, to do something to overcome it. It's part of life. Errors are part of life. And certainly part of development. Errors, whatever that means. It means not immediately achieving one's goal. And there are tremendous developmental advantages to experiencing problems and engaging in problem solving. The primary thing is problems alert us and make us look around potentially and notice things that we never noticed before. Again, I hope to play around with you when we meet face to face and try to drive this point home. So, those are the basic processes of components of constructivism. I'll come back in a second. Well, actually, what I'm going to do is stop for a minute. The developmental outcomes of constructivist interventions. They are, number one, cognitive organization, characterizing stage development, intent, means, end behavior, object permanence, conservation in children who are typically school age. That is, constructivism promotes cognitive development and higher levels of cognitive organization, more complex relationship making in our mind. Representation and awareness of objects, procedures, and causal relations. As we establish objectives for ourselves and act to achieve objectives, we notice things, which allows us to represent new things and become aware of objects, procedures, and causal relations. Remember the little boy who was popping, by the way, the best constructivist tape I've shown event was demonstrated again by that child with Down syndrome who I asked you to comment on. Remember that. And that experience that child created himself, as all kids create themselves, as they establish goals for themselves, without necessary help from adults. Remember, he ran into problems popping the beads together. He had nipples facing nipple with that before he gave thought to the attributes of the beads. And he had his grasp. He had issues with his grasp, so that the bead string was somewhat flexible, or beads were connected when he wanted them apart, or dropped, or were hidden as he was trying to achieve something. Well, what could have come out of that? Well, when he was finagling with the beads, and he ran into the nipple to nipple problem, he had to explore visually those beads and physically manipulate them, turn them around. And perhaps he noticed, and there seemed to be evidence that he did notice, attributes of the beads. Now, attribution is one of Leahy's content categories, and that reflects the child's ability to make a part-whole relationship, differentiate parts from the whole, and relate them. So that's an example of the kinds of things and how children discover things as they engage in constructive activities. Finally, of course, as I said, what comes out of constructive experiences are more complex relationship making, in addition to the representation of things, more complex relationship making. Not only physical relationship making, but the kinds that occur in one's mind. So therefore, the third developmental outcome on this list is language content, content categories, and semantic relations. Relations. Remember, these general relations are the target of constructive intervention and necessary for the development of that internal part of language that children impose on their world, that then allows them to learn more and more from the world. So think about that, and we'll continue this conversation when we meet. Okay, here's one more little clip for you, and I named this on the PowerPoint that this lecture series refers to. I named it Integrative Programming and Curriculum. This is my recommendation for programming and curriculum development for children with autistic spectrum disorder, and in fact for any child that we work with, really, essentially. I reviewed 3 approaches to the treatment of autistic spectrum disorder. Applied behavior analysis, I like to gesture but it's not showing up on video. Applied behavior analysis, Greenspan's relationship-based approach. The ABA approach, by the way, is the Lovaas approach, let's call that. Greenspan and Geller's and Serena Weider's relationship-based approach, and the constructivist approach, the neo-Piagetian constructivist approach. These were 3 approaches to that I've reviewed to the treatment of children with autistic spectrum disorder. Now, autistic spectrum disorder is a complex, multi-system developmental disability. Complex is the key word. On top of that, language is a complex behavioral system comprising content, multiple components of form, and use with its multiple components. It's all very complicated, not to mention that language interacts with sensory motor, cognitive and psychosocial factors, cultural factors. There's a lot of stuff to consider. Therefore, rather than choosing one approach over another approach, as if any one of the approaches that I spoke about can account for all development in autistic spectrum disorder, I recommend an integrative approach. That is, understanding where each fits in with reference to the goals we set, and keeping each in mind when we do set goals. I recommend utilizing ABA programs and operant techniques to facilitate compliance, that is to get the kid to do what you want the child to do when you want them to do it, and receptive language. Utilize floor time and constructive techniques to facilitate expressive language. Coordinate objectives of all interventions. Allow research on normal child development to influence goal setting and the sequencing of objectives, regardless of the teaching techniques. I do raise an issue with the ABA curriculum and its set series of in many ABA programs, the set series of objectives, sitting, looking, attending, imitating, etc. I think that I challenge you to identify in the developmental literature, which is evidence-based, that is the developmental literature with typically achieving children, where that sequence is in any way supported by that kind of research. Now you say, well, these kids are disabled, they have a disability, but they're kids, and the process and the behavioral system is language, and the process by which it is acquired, again, is quite complex and requires that we consider all of the components, and not just the taking in of information from the world of components, but also the internal organizational components as well. Research on normal child development really does address those internal organizational components. And it's evidence-based. It is actual evidence. Run trials across all interventions regardless of teaching techniques. Yes, on the side of ABA and its techniques and processes, the idea of running trials is certainly very valuable. And reinforcements, which are part of reinforcements and extinguishers, are part of all interactions. There is no arguing with the idea that operant processes are part of all learning. Therefore, reinforcements should be intrinsic to the targeted objective, not extrinsic whenever possible. That is, if the child is working towards something, it's better that it be related to, that the outcome serve as the reinforcer. The outcome should be related to the goal that the child has as the child engages in the activity, and as opposed to an extrinsic thing like some extrinsic tokens or food when the child is working on has a different kind of objective in mind. So those are my comments about the approaches to intervention for children with autistic spectrum disorder, and thank you for watching.